Revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. One decision, one word, and suddenly an empire crumbles. For Caitlin Clark, revenge wasn't about firing shots on social media or snapping back in interviews. Her revenge was devastatingly simple. She said no. No to Geno Auriemma. No to UConn's legacy. No to the $1 million offer that came crawling back to her years later.
Like I said earlier, they actually had odds that, she was like third or fourth in the betting odds to be MVP of the WNBA. That's such a slap in the face to every WNBA player. It's unbelievable, right?
On paper, it looked absurd. Who walks away from over $1 million for just 8 weeks of basketball? But this wasn't just a contract. It was the lifeline of a man who once dismissed her, belittled her, and treated her like an afterthought. When Clark rejected it, she didn't just pass on a paycheck. She humbled the man who never thought he could be humbled.
That's the worst part about new fans. They have no perspective. There's no context. So they just say ridiculous nonsense.
And that's what makes this story bigger than basketball. It isn't just about points, assists, or trophies. It's about power. For decades, Geno Auriemma was the gatekeeper of women's basketball, the coach who decided who mattered, who got the spotlight, and who faded into obscurity. But Caitlin Clark flipped that script. She didn't need his approval, his program, or his checkbook. She built her empire without him. And when he finally reached out, she turned him away with the kind of quiet authority that says, I don't need you. You need me. Every revenge story starts with a mistake. Geno's wasn't a blown play or a bad timeout. It was arrogance. Pure blinding arrogance. Before Clark became the face of the sport, before the sold-out arenas and record-shattering TV ratings, she was just a kid with a dream. She admitted it openly. UConn was the coolest place on earth. The dynasty, the empire, the home of Terrace Moore Stewart, the mountaintop of women's basketball. For a girl growing up in Iowa, there was nothing bigger. And when recruitment time came, the path seemed obvious. The most electrifying talent of her generation, pairing with the greatest recruiter the game had ever known. But the call never came. Geno never picked up the phone, never called Clark, never called her parents, barely even sent a message through her AAU coach. For the greatest recruiter of all time, that silence was deafening. And it wasn't an oversight. It was a choice. The message was clear. She wasn't their priority. His excuse, UConn had already locked in Paige Beckers and he didn't want to. Point guards. On the surface, fine. But then came the insult. Geno suggested that if Clark really wanted UConn, she should have called him. Think about that. The coach who built his legacy on spotting once-in-a-generation talent. Years before anyone else decided Caitlin Clark wasn't worth the effort then. Blamed a teenager for not chasing him. That wasn't just a recruiting miss. It was disrespect, the kind you don't forget. And in return, Clark quietly filed it away. If Geno didn't believe in her, she'd go somewhere that did. So she chose Iowa, a program without UConn's banners, mystique, or dynasty glow. To many, it looked like a consolation prize. But for Clark, it was liberation. At Iowa, she wasn't Paige's shadow. She wasn't Geno's afterthought. She was the recruit, the one who would carry the program. And from the second she laced up in Iowa City, she rewrote the script. Her logo, 3ES, weren't just shots, they were statements. Her sold-out arenas weren't just crowds, they were proof. Her record-shattering TV ratings weren't flukes, They were receipts. Every basket, every viral highlight, every broken record was a reminder. You missed this. Meanwhile, Geno doubled down. Instead of humility, he leaned on arrogance. He brushed her off with condescending sound bites, calling her a kid playing like she's in the driveway. Instead of acknowledging her as a generational force, he tried to shrink her brilliance into something ordinary. But ordinary doesn't sell out Madison Square Garden. Ordinary doesn't drag the WNBA into mainstream relevance. Ordinary doesn't cost you millions. And that's where the irony bites deepest. Geno closed the door when Caitlin Clark knocked. He thought she'd fade into just another good player. Instead, she built the biggest empire women's basketball has ever seen without him. And when he finally circled back, contract in hand, Clark didn't rage. She didn't gloat. She simply said no. And that one word cost him more than a championship loss ever could. Geno Auriemma just couldn't help himself. Anytime Caitlin Clark's name came up, he found a way to drag her back into PAYBACK's comparisons. If Clark was fearless, well, Paige was too. If Clark was connecting with fans, so had Paige. It wasn't random. It was strategy. By tethering Clark's rise to his chosen players, Geno kept himself in the spotlight. He wanted the world to believe her success was nothing new, nothing separate from the dynasty he built. But backhanded compliments were thin. And people noticed, fans noticed, analysts noticed, other coaches noticed. They saw through the act. Clark's brilliance didn't need qualifiers. She was drawing bigger crowds than most professional franchises, breaking records the sport had never seen and rewriting the conversation around women's basketball. Yet there was Geno, smiling for the cameras while subtly clinging to his throne. Behind the charm was insecurity, the kind that comes when the spotlight is moving away and there's nothing you can do to stop it. And eventually the mask slipped. The sly digs weren't enough anymore. Geno went from undermining Clark to outright attacking the people who supported her. For months, his strategy had been shade, disguised as commentary. Then in June 2024, during an interview on The Dan Patrick Show, he crossed a line he could never walk back. The Hall of Fame coach, the man who was supposed to represent the pinnacle of women's basketball, didn't just question Caitlin Clark. He went after her fans.
The delusional fan base that follows her disrespected the WNBA players by saying she's going to go in that league and tear it apart. There were actually odds on she's third or fourth in betting odds on being MVP at the WNBA. These people are so disrespectful and so unknowledgeable and so stupid that it gives women's basketball a bad name. Okay, so the kid was set up for failure right from the beginning.
His words weren't subtle. He called her supporters delusional. He said they didn't understand the game. And then, unbelievably, he claimed they were so clueless they were damaging women's basketball itself. What crime had they committed? Believing Clark could finish top 4 in MVP voting as a rookie. To Geno, that wasn't passion. It was stupidity. And Diana said it best. This kid's in for a rude awakening. Think about that for a second. Millions of new eyes had just flooded into women's basketball because of Clark. Families were showing up in jerseys. Kids were camping out to meet her. Casual fans were tuning into WNBA broadcast for the first time ever. And Geno's response wasn't gratitude, wasn't celebration, but insult. Instead of welcoming the wave of new energy, he mocked it. This wasn't analysis. This wasn't a coach breaking down strengths and weaknesses. This was personal. It was a direct shot at the lifeblood of Clark's movement, the very people who had carried women's basketball into the mainstream spotlight. Geno wasn't just dismissing Clark, he was dismissing the fans who made her rise possible.
And
because he's Geno Auriemma, people listened. His words carried weight, which is what made them so damaging and so revealing. By calling her fans clueless, he wasn't just underestimating
them.
He was underestimating her.
He was
saying the hype wasn't real, that the success wasn't sustainable, that in the end, he'd be proven right. But here's where the story turns delicious. Geno wasn't right. He wasn't even close. Clark didn't clap back on Twitter.
She
didn't cut interviews. She didn't need
to.
Her response came the only place that mattered, the court. And what followed wasn't just vindication.
It was
a demolition of Geno's credibility. Caitlin Clark went out and won Rookie of
the Year.
She didn't stop there.
She
made all WNBA first team.
And when the
MVP votes were counted, she finished exactly fourth, right where her supposedly delusional fans had predicted she would. The very prediction Geno laughed at became reality. And with it, his authority crumbled. It wasn't just a win for Clark. It was vindication for her fans, the ones he had mocked and insulted. Every parent who brought their kid to see her, every casual fan who tuned in, every new supporter who bought into the hype, Geno dismissed them as a problem. Clark proved they were prophetic. And the beauty of it, she did it without saying a word. Silent revenge. No rant, no confrontation, no drama, just results. Night after night, she delivered performances that left no room for excuses. Logo threes, crossovers that froze defenders, assists that lit up highlight reels.
By
the time the awards came in, there was no debate. She had silenced him without ever speaking his name. Do you see the poetry in that?
Geno had positioned
himself as the gatekeeper of women's basketball knowledge, the wise elder who knew better than the fans, better than the media, better than anyone else.
And
yet the fans were right.
Clark was right.
Geno was wrong. Every arena she sold out, every record she shattered, every accolade she earned was another reminder that he wasn't the kingmaker anymore. She didn't need him. She never did. And here's the irony. Clark wasn't trying to prove Geno wrong. She wasn't chasing his approval. She wasn't even
thinking about him. She was just being
Caitlin Clark. And that was enough to expose him, enough to humble him, enough to show the world that he was no longer the one shaping the narrative. She was. By the end of her rookie year, it wasn't just about whether Clark had lived up to the hype. It was about how completely she had obliterated every doubt. Geno's insults didn't age well. They aged like milk in the sun. His comments about her fans now read like some of the worst takes in sports history. Bitter, insecure, and embarrassingly wrong.
But
Geno couldn't let go. Being wrong wasn't something he could stomach. And by now, it wasn't just about Clark's game.
It
was about what she represented, the changing of the guard, the shift in power, the undeniable truth that women's basketball no longer revolved around him. And instead of accepting it, he did what he always does. He kept talking. Interview after interview, podcast after
podcast.
Her name never far from his lips. And each time the pattern repeated, a little praise, a little dig, a compliment wrapped in a disclaimer. But the more he talked, the more obvious it became. Caitlin Clark wasn't just rewriting the record books.
She was
living rent-free in Geno Auriemma's head.
At
some point, words stopped being enough. Geno Auriemma had spent months trying to shape the narrative with sly comparisons, backhanded compliments, and digs at Clark's fans. But Clark kept winning, kept shining, and his influence kept shrinking. So he pivoted.
If he
Couldn't control the narrative with his mouth, maybe he could do it with money. That's how the $1 million offer came into play. By then, Geno had already tried everything. He ignored her as a teenager. He brushed off her eyes.
he
Belittled her supporters. He tried to reframe her stardom as just another byproduct of UConn's dynasty. None of it worked. Clark kept climbing and Geno
kept fading.
Then came an opportunity, wrapped in dollar signs. A brand new venture unrivaled, a 3-on-3 women's league backed by Breanna Stewart and Nfisa Collier, with Geno deeply involved. Behind the curtain, the league had ambition. It had funding, but it didn't have the one thing that mattered most, a face.
And there's a lot of investors in this league. One investor, been trying to keep quiet about, his investment in the league ever since his comments that he made about a young rookie. Pretty much, had him in the headlines for about a month and a half. That is Geno Auriemma, dog. I'm here to tell you, he's part owner of this league.
And that's